back and forth between Kentucky and Arizona for some time. A lot of folks in the audience included. So quite happy to have a chance to come to the department and meet people, talk a little bit of my work and so forth. This is a presentation built on some various sets of papers that have been published over the past couple of years, some of them fairly recently, and just trying to give sort of a sense of the sort of larger picture, what I'm trying to do, what I've been interested in as of late, and really where I start with is sort of this image. It's how I have really sort of thought about and seen the world in the past, I don't know, 5, 10 years when I started thinking about when Google Maps first came out, when Google Earth started coming out. Then more recently, you have geosocial media. And the way I think about the world, the way I take it, approach as a research subject, is thinking about these layers of information. There's other layers on here. You can think about cell phone calls, other sort of things going out there. But in particularly, user-generated stuff. Wikipedia entries, tweets, Flickr photos, what have you. Every once in a while I try to update this photo with the latest logos and things like that. And the thing that is really sort of important and interesting for me is how this changes the way we experience a city, how cities are represented to us. And most often we're going to see cities through the phone. A lot of people have a smartphone. There's some interesting differences to who has access and who doesn't have access. But more recently, you're starting to see people talk about devices like the Microsoft HoloLens, which is this one up here, and this Oculus Rift virtual reality. Anyone know what happened to Oculus Rift about a year ago? Facebook bought it for about $2 billion. So Facebook is starting to experiment, and I'm not quite sure who knows what they're exactly doing, but we've got some big players spending a lot of money thinking about how you might access this information. This works pretty well. We can use it, but also thinking about putting this sort of live feeds onto some sort of device that we can see as we look around. Now, this really gets into the big research questions. How is this changing the city? Increasingly, we have this digital presence, this social media presence that we're both contributing to, but it's also coming back and reflecting upon what we see, what we don't see. A lot of it's geo-reference. We'll talk a bit about that. Some of it is not. There's interesting network components to this as well. But a lot more stuff is getting documented. Everyone, people tweet about what they had for lunch, where they're going, and so forth. And the key thing with this is that there's a lot of sort of hidden power going on, particularly the way these representations are constructed and presented to us. And that's what the first part of the talk I'm really going to be focusing on, that process. And just to give you an example of what I mean by this is, I did a search in Google Maps for good restaurants in Tucson. I have no idea what good restaurants are in Tucson, though I dare say the subway at the airport is not probably on most top 10 lists. But there's a particular sort of constellation of algorithms that go in there. You can see these down here seem to get more labels. Might have to do with the fact that they're not densely packed. There's some labeling algorithms going on here. Some of these show up with labels. Some of them show up with big dots, little dots. These change what we see, what we overlook. You even see an example way up here of an advertising company. This is the world being presented to us in a particular way. A fairly easy example, but I really want to work on sort of showing how this sort of plays out in different ways, and I'll run through that a bit. Just to add the idea that this is really important because it's problematic. I'd like to show this slide, which is this wonderful app called Girls Around Me. Used to be available in the iPhone store. It no longer is because it got pulled. But essentially what these people were doing were collecting Foursquare check-in data and then re-aggregating it and then pushing it back out to people, users of this app, where they could see profile pictures, information about a person, and essentially check and say, who is in this bar, who is in this restaurant, and so forth. And some great advertising copy in here as well. And I put this out here, because this is part of the mix as well. This volunteered information, or not so much volunteered information, can be repackaged, repurposed. A lot of the stuff that we're putting out there, and we don't know what happens to it. Well, we do know what happens to it. The internet never forgets anything. So a lot of this stuff will come back and is accessible to various ways. One of the things I'll talk about later on is this database of geotagged tweets we've been developing at the University of Kentucky. We have about 10 billion tweets at this point, every geotagged tweet in the world for the past 3 years. And we're just a goofy little research group. We have not a lot of money. There's a lot of people who are doing this in a much more serious way. So, oops, wrong computer. And so where I'm building from this is thinking about how we start thinking about how software code, data for that matter, are tied into the way cities work, the way urbanity functions. There's a lot of interesting work on this in terms of Friss and French, automatic production of space. Kitchen and Dodd talked about code space. Rob Kitchen had a recent book just on data, the data revolution. This is something that is increasingly of interest of geographers and social scientists in terms of how this is playing out with what we see, how we live our life, and so forth. The other key thing is a lot of this stuff happens behind the scenes. We don't know what the ranking algorithm is exactly in Google Maps. We know it's happening, but we tend to, we can't see it's a very black box kind of phenomenon. But just because, and particularly because it's unseen, doesn't mean it's not happening. And again, since it's been happening in a cartographic manner, geography has long had things to say about the power of maps and how it produces certain understandings, certain representations, and so forth. And so what I'm really interested in, so this introduction, is thinking about how this all ties up, how we're presenting with certain representations, how we feed back into those representations, and how this is sort of the power involved with this. So what I first want to go through is go through 4 kinds of power when we talk about digital augmentations, or these, sometimes referred to these as augmented realities. I don't want this to be necessarily an exhaustive list. I'll walk through these a bit at a time, but just sort of highlighting these moments where we can make this sort of largely unseen process more seen. The first kind of power is just distributed power. Who is participating in making this kind of data? And there's all kinds of interesting research on how different social media skews by gender or age or location. At lunch I was talking about it a bit with the students who were there. And it's a key question because if you're not participating in this kind of data production, your voice is sort of cut off from the start, at least in these augmentations. So, I keep on using the wrong computer. All right. So, first example is this is just some early work we did through the floating sheet space, just looking at index for Google Maps. This is back in 2011. Just looking at how much content there was per capita, or in this case per 1,000 people. You see a relatively concentrated clusters in North America, Western Europe, a lot, not much in the rest of the world. Things have changed a bit. It's not quite as stark as it once was, but if you look at some other markers, this one is actually a pretty interesting one. This, just to go back, this is a very sort of simple, just Google place mark per capita. This is more complex. It's looking at Wikipedia edits in the English language. We use the English language because it's as it's the most inclusive one in terms. This will look different depending on which language you're using. I'll get a bit more into that later on. And again, this is Wikipedia edits to the English edition made from people in that country. And so this brings up all kinds of questions of who is participating in the representation of themselves. And of course, this is all sort of scalar issues. If you go down to the country level, and you can slice and dice this at all kinds of levels. We just did this because this is sort of the way, the point at which we can do it reliably. So you see places like Sub-Saharan Africa, Central Asia, a lot of what's being written about these places are being written by people from the outside, not from people who are actually there. Of course, this might be different, looking at different languages, but this gives you sort of the first stab at how this idea of distributed power comes to play. The other sort of question I want to get at is communications power. Because it's not just enough to be able to be participating in making the data, it's also having the connections and the power to make sure your presence, your ideas are actually being accepted. Language is a key part of this. There's lots of other ones. My favorite example of this idea of communication power is Mahmende. Anyone ever hear of MacMende? You guys are not up on your Kenyan pop culture. Okay, MacMende is, in some terms, in some ways, completely throwaway. He's sort of a silly piece of Kenyan pop culture. He's sort of a Chuck Norris kind of figure. Supposedly MacMende comes from the Dirty Harry line, "Make my day." You know, it's slurred together. I'm not sure. It's something I'm not too familiar with. The real point about this is that, so it's a silly piece of pop culture. Wikipedia is awash with silly bits of pop culture. If you go, you can get, you know, detailed listings of Brady Bunch episodes and so forth. The point was that when the Kenyans who came up with this, were having fun with this, were playing around with this idea, put together a Wikipedia page for MacMende, the editors of Wikipedia took it down. Because there's complicated reasons. This has to do with what Wikipedia considers to be reliable sources and sort of justifiable sources, often something online. And so the Kenyans were unable to get this Wikipedia entry up there. They put it back up, came back down, and it wasn't until some Westerners, particularly Westerners tied to newspapers and blogs, started writing about this whole occurrence that there was actually linkable sources, and MacMende could stay up on Wikipedia. So, you know, it's an example, again, who gets to participate in a particular conversation. Another example, the same idea, goes back to a case study called the Bronze Soldier of Tallinn in Estonia. For a bit of the back history, Estonia was occupied by the Soviet Union for 50 years post-World War II. Gained its independence in the early 90s or 1990. This particular statue was one of the few Soviet monuments left in downtown Tallinn, the capital. Very much a symbol of pride and sort of national, sort of nationhood for Russian speakers, a symbol of oppression and Soviet occupation for Estonian speakers. At a point in 2000, I guess it was 2007, this statue was relocated from its downtown location to a suburban location, a cemetery about 2 kilometers outside. There were riots for 2 days. Someone was killed. They had the first so-called cyber war, where there's denial of service attacks on Estonian websites. And so it was a really big deal. It was just sort of this concentrated action of what's going on. And what we did with this as part of this paper was we started looking at the Wikipedia entries. Again, there's lots of different, you look at a Wikipedia entry, depending on what it is, you're likely to find many different languages represented in it. And we started comparing the version that was told within the Estonian version, the Russian version, and the English version. And just to give you sort of a rough, there's some other, you can look at it in lots of other ways, but just in terms of raw numbers, the overall size of these kind of discussions, you can see that the Russian version, the Russians had a lot more to say about this particular statue than either Estonians or the English, or the English speakers. It was a lot longer, that went into a lot more details in lots of ways. More interesting, though, was the size of the discussion. The Estonians there was some discussion, but they were more or less in agreement. Same with Russian speakers. But in the English Wikipedia page, there was a lot more discussion. This is the point at which people hash out what is actually going on with this particular phenomenon and so forth. So again, I want to highlight this. This is a moment where you see this sort of conflict, this sort of power, and also in some ways this segmentation. A particular slice of the internet gets one view versus another view, depending particularly languages. It's more complicated than that, but language is actually quite useful for highlighting this particular effect. All right, code power, again, sort of ties into what I've talked about already, a sort of example of good restaurants in Tucson, what gets ranked, what doesn't show up. Another way to make this visible is, again, looking at languages. This coded power, if you just do a search for restaurants in Tel Aviv, using the same search criteria, same search locations, depending if you search in Hebrew, English, or Arabic, not only do you get different results, again this ties back to how much data is there in a particular language in a particular place about a particular thing, but also the whole listing becomes very different. Sort of hard to see this exactly, but the kinds of restaurants that are being listed are listed there, and the order in which they're listed differs depending on which language you're using. And this is something that makes the news. I mean, we'll see this kind of thing. There was recently, I guess this was, if I remember correctly, yeah, it was about a year ago, Facebook had a lot of press about the experiment, the social experiment, where they sort of made your feed slightly less happy and slightly more happy, and then they studied to see what kind of behavior patterns were going on. Facebook got a lot of flack, a lot of interest in that particular one. Actually, I find much more interesting this one by this blog post by Christian Rudder, who is the founder of OkCupid, and his sort of defense of this, because he's basically saying we're in the business of matching people, but quite honestly, we don't know what we're doing. So we're constantly running experiments to see what kind of, how to weight, various traits, pictures, and so forth. And so it's a very sort of interesting debate, but this is something that's actively happening in terms of how things are ranked and how things are being presented. In this particular case, not particularly spatially, but there's still this element of code power. Oops, keep on hitting the wrong computer. Okay, last bit, and I'm going to move on to other research then, but I just want to sort of lay out these ways in which this power shows up within social media. What we refer to as timeless power. And this is really the way these representations really can become ossified in some way. And not necessarily in the same way every time, but also the way they contribute to follow-up searches. There's all kinds of things that go into search result rankings, and once something gets sort of hard-coded, not to say hard-coded, once something starts showing up to the top, it's more likely to stay up on the top. Actually, Chris and I talked about that in terms of his marketing strategy for the GIS program. Get enough stuff out there talking about the masters in GIS. It's called search engine optimization. You start getting, start occupying a very sort of privileged position on search results. All right. Example I want to talk a little about is actually, then sort of look at the spatial element, is what happened in Abbottabad, Pakistan, shortly after the raid on Osama bin Laden's compound. This are some screenshots that happened shortly thereafter, that same day, or as soon as the news hit. And you can see all manner of user-generated place marks starting being added in here. The bin Laden pot farm, there's all this kind of activities. One of the things people actually adapted to, you could, at that time on Google Maps, you could review places or you could review amenities. So people started doing reviews of the compound, complaining about helicopter noise and things like that. It also became more extreme within Google Map Maker, which is a way in which people can access and map and edit the base map. This is my particular favorite. This is actually a polygon that was edited into the base map of a big arrow pointed to this location of the compound. There are all kinds of place marks. I mean, I won't belabor it. You can sort of imagine the kind of rhetoric and kind of discussion that was going on here. Revisited the site 2 years later. It was all cleaned up. It was pretty messy for a while, but essentially Google got together, cleaned this up. There's still this issue of its naming, the Osama bin Laden hideout compound. I'm not quite sure why they decided to go with that particular name, but that's how it is. I didn't check lately. I think it's still labeled this way. But though they cleaned up the immediate area, if you start looking around a little bit, you start seeing some other sort of results that came out of that particular time. Well, at this point, 2 years ago, when the screenshot was taken. Again, you have the Osama bin Laden hideout compound down here. Up here, though you can't see it in the scale, was a hospital, or is a hospital. And as people were going around and editing Osama bin Laden, some people started branching out and started reviewing other locations as well. This particular hospital ended up getting some of these reviews, making connections between this hospital and Osama bin Laden. And the thing I want to emphasize, this is 2 years later, this area has been cleaned up. There's no longer that sort of all that hodgepodge of user-generated activity. But this hospital, which, as far as I've been able to tell, had no connection to Osama bin Laden except being located nearby in space, still has this stuff going on. Again, there's all kinds of issues to the extent to which the people of this town or this hospital are making use of these information, but it does have this continuation, this sort of power, this sort of momentum tied to it. So that's sort of the examples of these sort of things. And this is essentially where I end some talk. I ran through that fairly quickly because I wanted to talk about sort of a next sort of step in thinking about how we work with this. But this is really just sort of a call to urge people to start thinking about these kind of questions, thinking about how social media, how this sort of digital layer of information really comes to play in a variety of human geography, urban geography kind of questions. Particularly interesting is the way everyone has their own sort of representation or augmentation brought up to them. It's based on your previous search history, it's based on what you've clicked, it's based on where you are, it's based on sometimes on what your network has done, your friends, and so forth. It has, the extent of who can participate in this process has opened up, but there's still some, still clear biases, and it's not as, evenly open for all. We talk about that in other ways. There's lots of research, interesting research in terms of how this information space is very lumpy, both in where it is and who gets to participate. But the question I really want to sort of talk about is, what I've been thinking more for the past year and a half or so is, what can we do with this? How can we use this? There's some interesting stuff, and there's lots of, and if, as I mentioned earlier, the Floating Sheet blog, we've done a lot of work on this particular thing in terms of data visualization. Some of it quite serious, some of it very tongue-in-cheek. Actually, I think right now, if it hasn't posted yet, we're supposed to have a map comparing hashtags supporting Kentucky basketball versus Wisconsin basketball. They tell me there's a game this weekend. But also thinking about how can we actually ask questions that are more significant than those particular things. Particularly when we start thinking about the smart cities movement. Now the smart cities movement is something that has really come out very strong in the past, let's say, 5 years or so. And they are very interested in what you might be able to do with this. This is a particular series of papers put out by IBM. There's lots of interesting ties to technology companies, because obviously technology companies have a vested interest in it. They're the ones who are going to be selling the technology, the software, the equipment, and so forth. But there's a lot of interest. I will also say it's a little too reductionist just to say that it's just about the technology companies. There's plenty of activity within city policymakers. There's Mayor Bloomberg's initiatives and so forth. There's a lot of stuff going on. There's a lot of people interested in how can we harness social media to answer questions. I didn't put this up here, but recently I got an email about a month ago from someone who is essentially coming from a math background, is now working at an urban informatics university, and was really interested in talking to me and getting access to some data we have, because they want to use social media to figure out how to, quote, run a city better. It was one of the most terrifying emails I've ever had, because I'm not quite sure, I don't know who this person is, I'm not quite sure where they're coming from, but that idea that someone is going to use this to run a city better is problematic in all kinds of ways. That said, I do think it's something we should think about, if for no other reason, that it is an active research question for a lot of folks, not necessarily within geography, but there's lots of geographers looking at this. One of the examples of this, what I'm calling sort of naive sort of geographic analysis of social media, is what came out in December. This guy named Eric Fisher. He does some amazing visualizations. I'm sort of picking on him a bit for this particular map, but more how it was sort of done through public relations. He does a lot of really interesting stuff, really great visualizations. But this tagline, the most detailed tweet map ever, with 6.3 billion tweets. All kinds of issues, problems with that. Just to list some, this whole overplotting problem. Most of those 6.3 billion tweets never actually ended on the map because they just would have covered up. Standard sort of cartographic problem. They would never actually show up the map because it would be too hard to load it. It would be too many resources. There's this whole idea that more equals better. It's not necessarily the case. And also, it really is only focused on a location. It's just putting pins on a map. And I will say that we've done lots of putting pins in the map as well with some of the works we've done. but we're also trying to think about how do we push this forward? How do we get some of this other kind of information out of social media? How do we use it to ask questions that are actually a little more meaningful than, wow, there's a lot of people who send tweets in Manhattan. Well, yeah, there's a lot of people in Manhattan, which brings up this XKCD cartoon, one of our favorites, in terms of geographic profile maps, which basically are just population maps. This is, no matter what you, whatever sort of social media or sort of phenomenon you explore, you're going to end up with a lot of red in the Northeast because there's a lot of people there. And we're sort of trying to think about how we can work and push this past this. And so the article that actually just, as far as I know, just appeared in Land. I think it's actually online right now. There's an SSRN version of this paper, if not, but I think it's actually officially out at this point, is looking at a specific question, a specific case study in the case of Louisville, and what's called the 9th Street Divide. First of all, let me give you a little orientation. Louisville, two neighborhoods I'm going to talk a lot about, the West End over here and the East End. The West End is a predominantly African-American neighborhood, relatively poor. The East End is predominantly white, suburban, more well-off, middle class. There's some pockets of wealthy people there as well. But two different parts of neighborhoods that really sort of define Louisville in terms of how people think about it. There's what's known as the 9th Street Divide. I'm putting in a big sort of bold line because it's an imaginary sort of spatial divide. There is a 9th Street, but it's really looms large in the imaginations of people from Louisville. It's a quote from an article talking about sort of differences in Louisville, about any Louisville who's lived here Louisvillian who's lived here for more than a full year knows instinctively the boundary line between West and the rest of Louisville, the West and the rest. And the standard warning, particularly people from the East Side, don't go west of 9th Street. And so I put this out here because we're trying to show, okay, we're getting a very sort of situated case study. We know sort of what is happening on the ground pretty well. We actually picked Louisville. Well, two of my two co-authors actually live in Louisville, so that was a big part of it. But also because we wanted to pick a city that wasn't New York or Los Angeles or San Francisco, which is where normally these things happen. And just sort of pick a more sort of mid-sized, more quote-unquote typical American city. So that's sort of the existing understanding that we wanted to explore. So we went and we pulled a bunch of data. And just to give you a background, the project that we have at University of Kentucky, we call it Dolly because it came out of floating sheep, and we have to make sheep jokes with everything we do. And it consists of every geotagged tweet that was issued in the world for the past 3 years. It's about 10 billion tweets. Useful in lots of ways. People were interested in getting access. We certainly have a conversation about that. But this was, in some ways, a very big data project that we sort of took the approach somewhat differently than big data might do, coming from sort of math or physics or something like that. We took all the tweets that were available to us within Louisville, about 6 million tweets. We then started slicing in different criteria. Tweets had to be, we defined the neighborhoods I showed you earlier. We identified all users who had 50 plus tweets in either of those neighborhoods and assigned them to one of the neighborhoods. If you had more tweets in 51% or more tweets in one neighborhood, that was what you were assigned. We did some other sort of cleaning. We sort of there's some people who are very active on Twitter, so we sort of down-sampled them so they wouldn't totally skew the results. We were trying to get a look at a larger number of people. Once we got down to these criteria, we ended up with about a couple thousand users in this data set. Again, trying to look at how people moved within the city based on these two neighborhoods. This is just the raw numbers. These are West End tweets with the 9th Street Divide. These are East End tweets and the 9th Street Divide. Again, you can start to see some of the patterns that go through. We looked at it in an interactive case, looking at the odd ratio, which is sort of a location quotient for people who are more familiar with that term. Places that were dark purple were predominantly places where there were places there were predominantly more tweets coming from West End users. Dark brown was for East End users. Some variation with the light purples, but there's also this real sort of hash area where there might have been, based on the metrics, that you could have assigned that to the West End or the East End. But we wanted to make this sort of this middle ground, sort of not necessarily contested ground, but places where things were a bit more even. And you can see a couple issues that come out. I'll show you some other maps as well. The West End really spills out to lots of other areas, both to the south, but also sprinkled out through the rest of the region. The East End really does not go past that 9th Street divide. This is one way to look at it. Another way to look at it is if we just look at hexes, and we're not doing this relative, that was sort of looking at West End users versus East End users. This is just looking at the numbers. All these hexagons are hexagons in which there were at least 50 tweets from a West End user or an East End user. And so you start seeing real differences in the boundaries of the neighborhood. And interestingly, this sort of idea of the 9th Street divide, which often is told as a tale of sort of segregation. This is the West End. The people who live in the West End are separate from the rest of the city. They don't have access to the rest of the city. They don't move in the rest of the city. It becomes somewhat different. You see West Enders moving through various parts of the city. There's some reasons tied to it in terms of opportunities for jobs and shopping and so forth. But you also have this East End neighborhood that is more expansive past its original definition, but also really doesn't cross the 9th Street divide, which again makes for a very different story of how these neighborhoods and how segregation works and operates within the Louisville case. You can also, the other thing we want to do is sort of show that how you start playing with some of the analysis, you start seeing different pictures. And we start looking at multi-levels, multi-scales, and anyone who's done these sort of hex bins know that one of the key criteria is how wide, how big do you make these hex bins. The ones in this previous map are about 1 kilometer wide, more or less. These, you can see, the underlaying one, this is one of these big ones, this is about 1 kilometer wide. But then we did an overlay. We made a smaller set of hex bins as well, just to take a look at what is happening in some of these more sort of middle ground areas, these larger hexagons that have these hashes. And you start seeing how this segregation process operates on different scales. Just to point out a couple of different examples, this hex bin right here was classified as one of those sort of mixed hex bins. When we take it down, drop down the scale, you see this really strong cluster of East End tweets coming from this particular area, very specific area, which are exemplified by places called Zanzibar and Sunergos, which actually I don't know, but my co-author tells me are sort of hipster central. So you have this little sort of cluster of hipsterdom right in, but then you have these other sort of activities, much more West End tweets surrounding here. Another example is this large hexagon out here. Again, it's sort of a mixed area, but when you start breaking it down to smaller areas, you find clusters around particular services. In this case, a hospital and then a shopping area with a Walmart. Another example is this real strong concentration of East End tweets associated with a fairly exclusive high school. Again, so this is just again to think about moving beyond just putting dots on the map. How might we use some of the social-spatial theories that we developed in human geography to use social media to start exploring some of these questions, seeing how this plays out within a particular case. The other one I want to emphasize is temporal differences. This is a real advantage with social media data. Almost all social media data has a timestamp, and so you can see how different parts of the cities operate during the course of the day, during the course of the year, or the course of the week, for example. So this right here is Churchill Downs. The only time Kentucky gets noticed is either in March or the beginning of May when the Kentucky Derby is run. This is where the Kentucky Derby runs. This is where we make news. During the racing season, you can see there's a fairly strong, overall this area has a lot more West End tweets over the entire course of the year. During the racing seasons, there's a pickup in tweets from both West End users and East End users. But in particular, you see this concentration or more, again, going back to the odds ratio, more higher representation of East End tweets in and around the grandstand and the infield of Churchill Downs, as well as this Papa John's Cardinal Stadium over here. During the rest of the non-racing season, you don't see a lot of activity within the racetrack itself, and largely surrounded by West End tweet activity. A couple exceptions as well. And again, I think this is really useful in showing how you can use social media to show temporal differences in how a particular urban space is being used. There's also, of course, some examples for qualitative approaches to this. I don't want to talk too much about this because this is more, we put this out sort of as an example. We just pulled out all tweets that contain the word ghetto in them. And you can see they're sprinkled all over the place, various commentaries and ideas. This is something I think is actually really interesting, really has a lot of interesting potential. Maybe not necessarily for tweets. Tweets are a little difficult given that they're 140 characters, but thinking about other sort of approaches to this kind of data, using social media, doing a more sort of qualitative approach. We talked about that a bit over lunch as well. So, just sort of summing up, I don't want to necessarily argue that social media data should be thought of as a substitute or an improvement over standard data. There's actually one of the big issues within smart cities. Often there's almost this sort of rollback, or people have talked about this rollback of state-run data series, the U.S. Census, things like that. Recently there's a report that the AEC, American Community Survey, is dropping its 3-year survey. Again, sort of this rollback from the state function of providing data. There's this interest within smart city proponents and other people for getting social media and using it to run cities better. It certainly is very available, is very accessible in lots of ways, but it is problematic, particularly about questions of inequality, because again, it ties into the bias in terms of who is using it. It's actually one of the things that's interesting about Twitter. Twitter is African Americans are overrepresented in Twitter space. It's one of the few sort of, often African American populations are lagging in technology adoption, but in this particular case, Twitter is in many ways an African American space. And again, it's a question of how you might use this or engage with people who are trying to use this data, because it is very much something that people, particularly within smart cities movement, particularly within sort of the urban informatics movement, are very interested in using this and are really coming from backgrounds where they have not thought about urban theory, urban geographies, and so these larger issues very much. Again, a lot of these people are coming from math, computer science backgrounds, can be very useful, but they also have some issues in terms of the kinds of questions they ask and what they think is necessarily significant. The point being, finding out there are a lot of people who do tweeting in Manhattan is kind of interesting, but not really interesting. It makes for a nice map, but there's a lot more that we might be doing with this. So I'm going to stop at that point and ask for questions. Contact information both for me and the sheet. We have separate existences. Happy to communicate in whichever form you prefer.